In the tense, pre-war years of the 1930s, a new and terrible gospel of warfare was being preached. Its prophets were men like Giulio Douhet of Italy, Hugh Trenchard of Britain, and Billy Mitchell of the United States. Their doctrine was simple, revolutionary, and apocalyptic. The bomber will always get through. They argued that the next war would not be won by armies bogged down in trenches. It would be won by great aerial armadas that would fly over the front lines, unopposed, and strike directly at the enemy's heart. They would shatter his factories, incinerate his cities, and, in a matter of weeks, break his civilian morale so completely that his government would be forced to sue for peace. It was a terrifying, seductive theory, but it contained one enormous, unproven assumption. It assumed that a bomber flying 5 miles high in the sky could actually hit anything. The American evangelists of this new doctrine, the men of the U.S. Army Air Corps, were true believers, but they were also profoundly, almost spiritually, repulsed by the European conclusion that the only way to break morale was through the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. The USAC was convinced there was a better, more moral, and more American way. They believed a war could be won surgically. They would not target cities, they would target the nodes of the enemy's war machine. They would, with pinpoint accuracy, destroy the specific ball-bearing factory, the single U-boat pen, the crucial electrical power plant. They would pull the plugs, and the entire industrial state would grind to a halt. This was the birth of the precision daylight bombing doctrine. It was a brilliant, humane, and strategically elegant theory that would become the central dogma of the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, and it was all built on a single technological promise. That promise was contained in a black, 2-foot-high metal box, guarded with a ferocity usually reserved for state secrets. It was a device so advanced, so complex, and so seemingly miraculous that its operators, the bombardiers of the B-17s and B-24s, were forced to take a personal oath to protect it. They were told that if their plane went down, they were to destroy the device with an incendiary grenade before saving themselves. They were told it was their most precious cargo, more valuable than the plane itself. This was the Norden Mark 15 Bombsight. To the American public, fed a steady diet of Saturday Evening Post covers and breathless newsreels, the Norden was a miracle. It was the Pickle barrel sight. It was an analog computer with gyroscopes, so sophisticated that it allowed a bombardier flying at 20,000 feet to look through a telescope, lock onto a target, and, with the push of a button, drop a bomb into a 100-foot circle. It was the physical manifestation of America's technological and moral superiority. It was the blue sky invention that would allow the 8th Air Force to win the war without descending into the barbarism of area bombing, that the British, under bomber Harris, were already pursuing. This is the story of that device. It is the story of a $2.5 billion, $40 billion today government program, a technological marvel that was, in reality, one of the most colossally expensive and operationally ineffective failures of the Second World War. This is the story of a moment of realization, not for the enemy, but for the American commanders themselves, as they looked at the smoking, cratered fields of Germany and were confronted with the dawning, horrifying truth: their pickle barrel. Bombs were missing their targets by an average of over a mile. This is the story of the Norden Bombsight and the strategic lie that was built around it. The father of this myth was a Dutch-born, Swiss-educated engineer named Carl Norden. Norden was a brilliant, eccentric, and insufferably arrogant genius. He was a devout Lutheran who despised the U.S. Navy officers he worked for, famously telling one admiral, "I can't work with you anymore. You're too stupid." The Navy tolerated his abrasive personality for one reason: he was obsessed with precision. Starting in the 1920s, the Navy had given him a simple problem: create a bombsight that would allow their high-altitude bombers to hit moving, maneuvering battleships. Norden's solution was not just a sight. It was a revolutionary 25-pound analog computer. The Norden Mark 15, as it was finalized, was a beautiful, complex piece of machinery. It was not a simple telescope. It was a system of gyroscopes, motors, gears, and mirrors that the bombardier used to take control of the airplane itself. The bombardier would lie on his stomach, look through the eyepiece, and find his target. He would then input the plane's altitude and airspeed. Then, the magic began. The bombardier would use 2 knobs to superimpose a crosshair over the target. These knobs did not just move the crosshairs, they fed information into the gyros, which calculated the rate of approach. This data was then fed to a second part of the system, the Stabilized Bombing Approach Equipment, or SBAE. This was, in effect, a primitive autopilot. For the final 30 seconds of the bomb run, the bombardier, not the pilot, was flying the plane. The Norden's computer was making thousands of microscopic adjustments, correcting for wind, drift, and vibration, keeping the plane locked on a perfect, unalterable collision course with the target. The bombardier's only job was to keep the crosshairs perfectly aligned. When the moment was right, the bomb sight itself, not the man, would decide. The perfect release point and automatically drop the bombs. In the clear, calm skies of the 1930s, at the Navy's test range over the deserts of California, the Norden performed miracles. It was achieving accuracies that were unheard of. It was, from 20,000 feet, putting bombs within a 75-foot circle. The Army Air Corps, watching these tests, was mesmerized. This was it. This was the pickle barrel. This was the technological key to their entire precision doctrine. They immediately classified the Norden as top secret and made it the centerpiece of their new 4-engine heavy bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress. The entire $2.5 billion B-17 program, its guns, its engines, its Flying Fortress name, was designed around a single purpose: to get this one miraculous 25-pound bomb sight to its target unharmed. But the war in the California desert was not the war in the skies over Germany. And the bomb sight had two hidden, fatal flaws. The first was that its miraculous accuracy was dependent on the bombardier seeing the target. He had to have a clear, unobstructed, 10-minute-long view of the pickle barrel to line up the perfect autopilot-controlled run. The second flaw was that Carl Norden had built his beautiful, delicate, Swiss watch-like computer with no regard for the men who would actually use it. The gyroscopes had to be spun up by hand. Calculations had to be entered manually. And, in an almost unbelievable design oversight, the complex lenses and mirrors of the telescopic sight would instantly and completely fog over in the freezing, unpressurized, sub-zero degree cold of a B-17 at 25,000 feet. In 1942, as the first B-17s of the 8th Air Force arrived in England, the reality of the European air war came as a profound shock. The blue sky that the Norden required was a fantasy. Skies over Germany and occupied France were a sea of thick, impenetrable, industrial-grade clouds. A bombardier would be lucky to get a 10-second glimpse of his target, let alone the 10 minutes the Norden needed to work its magic. And when that glimpse came, his eyepiece would be fogged over with ice. But even more terrifying was the flak. The German Fliegerabwehrkanone, the dreaded 88, created a sky so thick with black, concussive explosions that the B-17s were being ripped apart. The idea of a long, straight, level, autopilot-controlled bomb run was not a precision tactic. It was a suicide pact. The pilots, in a desperate attempt to survive, began to jink, weave, and take evasive action, throwing the Norden's delicate gyroscopes into a state of useless confusion. The precision doctrine was colliding, violently, with reality. When the first bomber groups of the American 8th Air Force arrived in England in 1942, they were filled with a near-religious zeal. They were the evangelists of precision daylight bombing, and they had the Norden to prove their gospel. Their British hosts, the commanders of RAF Bomber Command, were skeptical. Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, the ruthless and pragmatic chief of Bomber Command, had already tried daylight bombing. He had watched his own unescorted bombers get torn to pieces by Luftwaffe fighters in 1940. His solution was one of brutal, cynical, but effective mathematics. He would bomb at night. And since he couldn't see a specific factory at night, he would, in his own words, de-house the German worker. He would incinerate their cities. The Americans, led by the idealistic General Ira Eaker, were horrified. They called Harris's strategy barbaric and indiscriminate. They were here to show the British and the world a better way. Their first missions, in late 1942 and early 1943, were cautious, soft. Targets in occupied France, coastal U-boat pens, railroad marshalling yards, and Luftwaffe airfields. And from the very first mission, the fatal flaws of the Norden Doctrine became horrifyingly apparent. The first and most relentless enemy was not the Luftwaffe. It was the weather. The European weather box, as the crews bitterly called it, was a near-permanent 10,000-foot thick layer of clouds and industrial haze. The blue sky of the California test range was a distant memory. Mission after mission was scrubbed as bombers took off, flew for hours, and returned with their bomb bays full because the bombardier could not get a single clear glimpse of the target. The pressure from Washington and from a skeptical British press began to mount. But when they did bomb, the second-order problems began. The bombardiers, freezing in their unpressurized cabins at -30 degrees, found their delicate Norden eyepieces instantly fogging over with a thick layer of ice which they had to chip away with their fingernails. Worse, the pilots, flying into a terrifying new world of German flak, were screaming at them over the intercom. The long, straight, level autopilot run that the Norden required was suicidal. A B-17 flying straight and level for 30 seconds was a dead duck for a German 88mm flak battery. The pilots, in a desperate, reflexive act of survival, would jink and weave, throwing the Norden's delicate gyroscopes into a state of useless confusion. The bombardiers, overwhelmed, were forced to abandon the miracle autopilot. They were, in effect, pattern bombing, dropping their bombs by eye or by guesswork in the general vicinity of the target. The post-raid reconnaissance photos that came back were a closely guarded and deeply embarrassing secret. The precision bombs aimed at the U-boat pens in Saint-Nazaire had not just missed the pens, they had missed the entire port. They were landing with horrifying inaccuracy in the French residential neighborhoods miles away. The Americans were not just failing at their precision doctrine, they were accidentally and ineffectually practicing the same indiscriminate bombing they so loudly condemned. The system was failing. The $2.5 billion investment was returning almost zero results. The Air Corps, in a state of quiet panic, began to implement a series of desperate patches that were, in effect, a quiet admission that the entire Norden and every plane doctrine was a lie. The first patch was the Lee Bombardier concept. The Norden was, it turned out, impossibly complex. The average 20-year-old bombardier, rushed through training, simply could not master its complex, fog-prone, gyro-spinning, 10-minute setup in the middle of a terrifying flak and fighter storm. So, the Air Corps gave up. They decreed that only the best, most experienced bombardier in the entire squadron, the lead bombardier, would actually use his Norden. The other 11 B-17s flying in the formation, each containing its own $25,000, $400,000 today miracle device, would not use it. Their bombardiers, now redesignated as toggliers, were given a single simple instruction: watch the lead plane. When his bombs drop, you drop yours. This was a staggering admission of failure. 90% of the Nordens flying over Germany were now just 250 pounds of useless, top-secret ballast. The entire precision of a 300-plane raid now rested on the eyesight and the ice-free lens of a single man. The second patch was an even greater compromise. To deal with the crippling cloud cover, the Americans began to adopt a British invention, the H-2X Mickey radar. This was a crude, primitive radar set that could, in theory, see through the clouds and paint a blurry green and black map of the ground below. This was the birth of the Pathfinder mission. The lead bombardier would now not even look for the pickle barrel. He would simply stare at a fuzzy, indistinct radar blob, guess which blob was the city of Bremen or Hamburg, and drop his bombs. The rest of the formation would toggle on him. This was not precision. This was not surgery. This was, by any definition, area bombing of a city, the very doctrine they had sworn they were above. But the myth of precision died hardest. The core belief, the dogma, was that if they could just get a clear day, and if they could just hit the surgical node, the war would be won. In the summer of 1943, that node was identified, the German ball-bearing industry, centered in the town of Schweinfurt. This was the ultimate pickle barrel. The entire German war machine, its tanks, its planes, its U-boats, ran on ball bearings. The USAF's own operational analysts, in a new and brilliant field, calculated that if they could destroy this one target, they could shorten the war by a year. This was the test. This was what the B-17 and the Norden were built for. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, a massive, unescorted, deep penetration raid. The results were a bloodbath. The unescorted bombers were torn to pieces by swarms of Luftwaffe fighters. 60 heavy bombers, 600 men were shot down or lost. It was a staggering 16% loss rate. But General Eaker, in his press releases, declared it a stunning victory. He claimed the Norden had worked, the plants were shattered, and the mission was a success. But then, the reconnaissance photos came back, and this was the true moment of realization. The high-altitude photos were laid out on tables in High Wycombe, the 8th Air Force headquarters. The commanders, men who had become legends, like Curtis LeMay, looked at the pictures from Schweinfurt, and the photos did not lie. The pickle barrel had been missed. The town of Schweinfurt was burning. Residential areas were pulverized. But the ball-bearing plants themselves, the actual targets, were still standing. A secret, internal USAF operational analysis report, compiled in 1944, would deliver the final, brutal verdict. In the ideal conditions of the Schweinfurt raid, only 16.8% of the bombs dropped had landed within the 1,000-foot precision circle. The vast majority of the bombs had scattered in a wide, useless pattern over 1.5 miles around the target. They had sacrificed 600 of their best men. They had lost 60 of their invincible fortresses, and they had failed to destroy the target. The Norden was a lie. The precision doctrine was a lie. And the bomber, it turned out, did not always get through. The Schweinfurt raid of August 1943 was a catastrophe, but the leadership of the 8th Air Force was trapped by its own doctrine. They could not admit failure. They doubled down. They convinced themselves that the core idea was sound. They had just not been brutal enough. They believed that if they hit Schweinfurt just one more time, it could still break the back of the German war machine. This decision would lead directly to the single darkest day in the history of the U.S. Army Air Forces. That day was October 14th, 1943, a day that would be forever known as Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force launched another massive, unescorted raid, sending 291 B-17s back to the same dreaded target, Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe was waiting for them. This time, they were not just waiting, they were prepared. They had studied the American tactics. They had massed over 400 fighters. The moment the American P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, low on fuel, turned for home, the German fighters attacked. And it was not a dogfight, it was a systematic, clinical execution. The German pilots had developed new tactics. They ignored the surviving bombers from the first raid and focused on the fresh, fully loaded B-17s, hitting them in waves. They fired aerial rockets from outside the range of the American .50 caliber machine guns, raking up the combat box formations. Then, the Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s would swarm, diving straight through the formations, their 30mm cannons tearing the flying fortresses apart. The air was filled with B-17s spinning out of control, parachutes blossoming, and men falling through the sky. Of the 291 bombers that flew to Schweinfurt that day, 60 were shot down over Germany. Another 17 were so badly damaged they crashed in the channel or were written off upon landing. 121 more were riddled with holes and casualties. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force lost 770 of its best, most experienced airmen. It was a 26% loss rate. The mission was a total, unmitigated disaster. And the bombing? The post-raid photos told the same, sickening story. The precision strike, fought with the blood of 700 men, had once again failed to destroy the factories. The Norden, in the chaos and terror of the air battle, had proven utterly useless. Black Thursday was not just a lost battle, it was the death of a doctrine. The unescorted, daylight, precision bomber campaign was over. It was a failure. The U.S. Army Air Forces suspended all deep penetration raids into Germany for 5 months. The myth of the self-defending flying fortress, built to protect its precious Norden Bombsight, was dead. The bomber, it turned out, did not always get through. But the story of the Norden contains one final, almost comical irony. While the Americans were sacrificing thousands of men guarding this top-secret device with their lives and incendiary grenades, the Germans had already had the complete plans for it since 1938. This was thanks to a German spy named Hermann Lang, a naturalized American citizen who worked as a draftsman and inspector at the Carl L. Norden Company. Lang, a loyal Nazi, had simply, over a period of months, carried the blueprints out of the factory in his coat. He then passed them to German Abwehr agents who smuggled them back to Berlin. The German Luftwaffe had built and studied their own perfect, working copies of the Norden before the war even began. When the first B-17s were shot down over Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were baffled. They knew all about the Norden. They had tested it, and they had rejected it. They had found it to be exactly what it was: a beautiful, overly complex, delicate, and fantastically clever piece of machinery that was completely impractical for the realities of a European air war. The German equivalent, the Luftwaffenrohr 7D, was simpler, more robust, and worked better in the cold. The entire fanatical American obsession with the Norden secrecy, the oaths, the grenades, it was all a complete farce. The Americans were dying to protect a secret that the enemy had already stolen, studied, and dismissed as a piece of junk. The crisis of late 1943 forced a total top-to-bottom reset of the American air war. General Ira Eaker, the great believer in precision, was promoted and sent to the Mediterranean. His replacement at the head of the 8th Air Force was a different kind of man, General Jimmy Doolittle, the man who had led the daring raid on Tokyo. Doolittle was not a dogmatic theorist. He was a pragmatic fighter pilot, and he brought with him the real wonder weapon that would win the air war. It was not a new bombsight. It was a new airplane. It was the P-51 Mustang. With its revolutionary Merlin engine and massive internal fuel tanks, the Mustang was the first Allied fighter that had the range to fly all the way to Berlin and back. Doolittle's first order was a revolution. He unleashed the fighters. No longer would they be forced to fly in close defensive formations around the bombers. His order was simple: go find the enemy, hunt them, sweep them from the sky. In the spring of 1944, the nature of the air war changed completely. The B-17s were now just the bait. Their real purpose was to lure the Luftwaffe into the air, where the swarms of P-51s would fall upon them and annihilate them. And they did. In what became known as the Big Week, the American fighters broke the back of the Luftwaffe. They shot the German Air Force out of its own sky, destroying its planes, and, crucially, killing its last generation of experienced veteran pilots. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the air war was won. The Allies had total, crushing air superiority. The bombers could now fly, almost unopposed, in clear blue skies. And now, finally, with no fighters to fear, with no flak to dodge, and with all the time in the world, the Norden Bombsight could finally prove its pickle barrel. Accuracy, right? Wrong. This was the final, inconvenient truth. Even in these perfect conditions, the Norden still failed. A definitive post-war analysis, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, would deliver the final, brutal numbers. In 1944, with total air superiority, only 7% of all bombs dropped by the Precision. 8th Air Force landed within 1,000 feet of their target. The pickle barrel myth, which the press was still reporting, was a complete fantasy. The median accuracy, even in perfect conditions, was closer to a mile. The U.S. Army Air Force commanders, now led by men like the ruthless, cigar-chomping Curtis LeMay, had known this truth for over a year. And if precision didn't work, there was only one alternative. If you can't hit a single factory, you must hit everything. You must hit the city. The American moral. High ground, which was built on the lie of the Norden, was about to be abandoned in the most devastating way imaginable. The air war was about to pivot from a failed experiment in precision to an all-out campaign of annihilation. By late 1944, the strategic air war was at a crossroads. The P-51s had swept the Luftwaffe from the sky. The bombers could, in theory, fly wherever they wanted. But the precision problem remained unsolved. The man who would definitively solve it was not an engineer, but a general. His name was Curtis LeMay. LeMay was not a theorist. He was a brutal, pragmatic problem solver. He had seen the failure of the Norden firsthand in the frozen skies over Germany. He knew the pickle barrel was a lie. He had looked at the post-raid photos. He knew that even with no fighters, his bombers flying at 25,000 feet could not hit a factory. They could, however, hit a city. This new, unwritten doctrine of area bombing reached its terrible climax in February 1945. The target, the German city of Dresden. Officially, the target was a vital transportation hub, but the tactic was pure, unadulterated terror bombing, indistinguishable from the RAF, that is, the Royal Air Force raids. Over 1,000 NE-200 American and British heavy bombers, flying in waves, dropped more than 3,900 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs on the city, which was packed with refugees. The resulting firestorm incinerated over 13 square miles of the city center and killed an estimated 25,000 people. The American B-17s, using their Pathfinder H-2X radar, simply aimed for the center of the radar blob. The moral: high ground, built on the fantasy of the Norden, was consumed in that fire. But the final, most definitive rejection of the Norden myth came when LeMay was transferred to the Pacific to command the 21st Bomber Command. He was now flying new B-29 superfortresses against Japan. He was tasked with bombing Japanese industry, and once again, his high-altitude, precision, daylight raids using the Norden were failing. The jet stream over Japan, a river of 200-mile-per-hour wind, was throwing the B-29s and their delicate bomb sights all over the sky. His bombers were missing their targets completely. LeMay, in a stroke of cold, brutal genius, made a decision that shocked his commanders and crews. He ordered a complete change in tactics. He ordered his B-29s to stop flying in the daytime. They would fly at night. They would not fly at 30,000 feet. They would fly at 5,000 feet, low and fast. And in the ultimate final admission of the Norden's failure, LeMay ordered the Norden bombsights ripped out of the planes. They were useless ballast. He also ordered most of the guns and ammunition removed to make room for more bombs. He was not going to hit a pickle barrel. He was going to hit the city of Tokyo. His weapon would not be the high-explosive bomb. It would be the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, designed to ignite Japan's paper and wood cities. On the night of March 9th, 1945, the Operation Meeting House raid began. 334 B-29s, flying low, dumped 1,665 tons of firebombs on Tokyo. The target was not a factory. The target was the civilian population. The resulting firestorm was a horror that dwarfed Dresden. It created a vortex of fire so hot it boiled the water in the canals. Over 16 square miles of the city were incinerated. In a single 3-hour raid, an estimated 100,000 people were killed, and over 1 million were left homeless. It was, and remains, the single deadliest, most destructive air raid in human history. The bombardier, who no longer had a Norden, was replaced by a radar operator who simply dropped his bombs when his screen showed he was over the burning city center. The war ended 5 months later after 2 atomic bombs, which were themselves the final, logical endpoint of this new doctrine of city annihilation. And the Norden bombsight? The $2.5 billion miracle, that was supposed to win a moral war, sat in crates, unused. The myth of the pickle barrel had died at Schweinfurt. The doctrine of precision had burned to death in the firestorms of Dresden and Tokyo. The story of the Norden is the story of a fatal contradiction. It was a beautiful, brilliant, and revolutionary piece of peacetime engineering that was completely and totally unsuited for the brutal, chaotic, and cloud-filled reality of war. It was a weapon that worked perfectly, right up until the moment it was needed. The American belief in this one, magical, top-secret device was a delusion. It was a lie they told themselves, a lie that cost billions of dollars, and, more importantly, cost the lives of tens of thousands of airmen who were sent to die unprotected in a desperate, failed attempt to prove that the pickle barrel was real. The final, damning indictment of the Norden bombsight and the entire precision daylight doctrine is not found in the smoking ruins of Schweinfurt or Tokyo. It is found in the icy waters of a Norwegian fjord, in the shattered, capsized hull of the German battleship Tirpitz. Because while the Americans were failing to hit a 1-mile-wide factory complex from 25,000 feet, a tiny specialized British squadron was, in fact, hitting the pickle barrel from a similar altitude. They just weren't using a Norden. While the Americans were obsessed with the strategic fantasy of pickle barrel bombing, the British, and specifically RAF Bomber Command, had a much more pragmatic and tactical precision problem. They didn't need to destroy thousands of ball-bearing factories. They needed to destroy one battleship, or one B-2 rocket site, or one critical, seemingly indestructible railroad viaduct. For Bomber Harris, his main force of Lancasters would continue to dehouse Germany at night. But for these special, impossible targets, he needed a new tool and a new team. That team was number 617 Squadron, the legendary Dambusters. After their famous, somewhat inaccurate, low-level raid on the Ruhr dams in 1943, the squadron was reformed into the most elite, high-altitude precision bombing force in the world. They were given the best pilots, the best navigators, and a new bomb sight. It was not the Norden. It was a British device called the Stabilized Automatic Bomb Sight, or S.A.B.S., and the S.A.B.S. was built on a completely different philosophy. The Norden's miracle feature was its fatal flaw, the autopilot. It tried to replace the pilot, locking the plane into a long, straight, predictable, and suicidal flight path. The S.A.B.S. did no such thing. It was a simpler, far more robust, gyro-stabilized aiming platform. It was a tool, not a computer. It calculated the drop angle, but it was a pilot, in coordination with the bombardier who flew the plane. It was a partnership between man and machine, not a replacement of one by the other. This led to a profoundly different doctrine. The Americans had 90,000 Norden bombsights. They gave this miracle device to thousands of rookie bombardiers who were then forced to toggle on one single, overworked lead bombardier. The British gave their best bombsight to one elite squadron, the 617, who then trained and trained and trained for months on one single objective. This was not the democratic, mass production American approach. This was an aristocratic approach. Give the best tool to the best men and expect perfection. The final piece of this puzzle was the bomb itself. While the Americans were dropping thousands of 500-pound dumb bombs, hoping one would hit, the British were pairing their new bomb sight with the genius of engineer Barnes Wallis. He had created the Tall Boy, a 12,000-pound earthquake bomb, and later, the Grand Slam, a 22,000-pound behemoth. These weapons were so expensive and so powerful that you could not afford to miss. Now, all the pieces were in place. The 617 Squadron, the robust S.A.B.S. bomb sight, and the Tall Boy bomb. Their target, the Beast, the German battleship Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was a fortress, the sister ship of the Bismarck, hiding in a fjord in northern Norway, protected by mountains, smokescreens, and massive torpedo nets. For 3 years, the Royal Navy and the RAF had tried and failed to sink it. It was the ultimate, impossible target. In November 1944, the 617 Squadron took on the mission. They flew their Lancaster bombers not at low level, but at high altitude, between 12,000 and 16,000 feet. Their bombardiers, using the S.A.B.S. bombsight, looked down, acquired the target, and began their runs. There was no complex autopilot. The pilots and bombardiers worked in perfect sync, lining up the shot. They dropped their tall boys. The results were not a near miss. They were not an area effect. The first 12,000-pound bomb struck the Tirpitz amidships. A second bomb hit. A third bomb hit. The Pickle barrel had been struck 3 times. The battleship, ripped open by the concussive force, capsized and sank in less than 10 minutes, taking 1,000 German sailors with it. The 617 Squadron, using a simpler bomb sight and a better doctrine, had achieved, in one mission, the precision that the entire 8th Air Force had failed to achieve in 2 years of trying. And it wasn't a fluke. In March 1945, the squadron, now using the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, targeted the Bielefeld Viaduct, a critical, seemingly indestructible railroad bridge. A single Grand Slam dropped with pinpoint accuracy from 13,000 feet, hit the viaduct, penetrated the earth, and detonated underneath it. The resulting earthquake shockwave completely and utterly demolished the bridge's foundations. This is the final, tragic lesson of the Norden bombsight. Its failure was not just one of technology, of fogging lenses and delicate gyros. Its failure was one of philosophy. The U.S. Army Air Forces had bet $2.5 billion on a myth. They believed a miracle. Black box could replace skill, training, and realistic doctrine. They believed it could deliver a moral, surgical victory, and it could be given to everyone. The British, in their quiet, specialized way, proved that real precision was not a function of a complex computer. It was a function of a robust tool, a specialized weapon, and, most importantly, a handful of elite, relentlessly trained airmen. The Norden was a top-secret lie, guarded by men who died to protect it, even as the enemy studied its stolen plans. The S.A.B.S. was a simple, effective tool that was used by men who lived to practice with it. The Americans built a $2.5 billion fantasy that led them, inevitably, to the firebombing of Tokyo. The British built a simple, practical system that led them, with surgical precision, to the bottom of a Norwegian fjord and to the wreck of the Tirpitz.